dans le domaine notamment de l'économie de la santé. Et je pense que ça va être une partie de sa présentation aujourd'hui. On le remercie d'avoir pris sur son temps, sur un calendrier dont je sais qu'il est très chargé parce qu'il a de nombreuses occupations, non seulement dans son laboratoire de recherche mais au niveau national, et donc on le remercie d'avoir pris de son temps sur son calendrier pour nous donner cette présentation aujourd'hui.
Oui, merci. So we do it in English because it's easier for you. Okay. But you can ask questions in French. Anyway. Of course, I talk with some other colleagues, and especially Mohamed, who is now teaching health economics here in the faculty and in the HU. And in fact, it's a two-part talk. In the first part, I will remind some of you or inform some of you about the current evolution of a debate about global health at the international level. And if I have time, I will give you some insights of the way the French experience of social protection may be used or not used as a way to inform this international debate. Indeed, the first version of this talk was prepared a few months ago for a semi-workshop on the same topic, which was held by WHO Middle East region in Dubai. So, as some of you may know, I hope, in 2000, all the nations, all the countries, part of the United Nations, which are nearly all the countries in the world, there are some exceptions like North Korea, but basically most countries in the world are part of the United Nations. In 2000 they agreed on a joint framework on 8 major goals for development, which are called Millennium Development Goals. Which were targets for the all United Nations multilateral agencies, but also we should be used as a framework for donor countries like France or the US for public development assistance for health, and of course also which were a kind of roadmap for national governments inside developing countries. There are 8 MDGs. The interesting thing is that the MDGs were targeted for 2015 and they were decided in 2000, but interestingly for quantifying the targets the reference was not 2000 but 1990. So there's a part of retrospective way in that goal. As you see, 3 of these 8 MDGs, child mortality, maternal health, and infectious pandemics were explicitly health-related, but as you may see, the other MDGs are directly or indirectly related to health. And for example, the first MDG, which was to reduce by half the proportion of the world population living in what has been defined as extreme poverty. Extreme poverty is that you have less than now it's $1.25 per day for living as an household. Okay, so of course this MDG is related with the others, and especially with the health ones. Currently, this is the only MDG which is already reached, because between 1990 and 2013, the proportion of the population living in this situation of extreme poverty has been divided by more than half. It was 47% of the world population in 1990. Today it's only 22%. It's not exactly the case because it's 22% because in that you include China. China, as you know, had an incredible economic growth in the last 30 years, and in China the proportion of people living in extreme poverty went down from 60% to only 12%. So if you put China out of the picture, the MDG is nearly reached, but not exactly, because it's 47% in 1990 to 27%. So China is an important, not bias, but element in that. But as you will see, for each MDG, these successes, and this is success, can be discussed or can be debated. Because it's true that we've been able to divide extreme poverty by half, but if you talk about relative poverty, that means the inequalities in the distribution of income and wealth between countries and inside the countries, these inequalities have increased. And you certainly have heard of the work of Thomas Piketty, which is a star now, a rock star in research in the US and in all the world, which shows, although some of his arguments can be a lot debated, but the fact that inequalities in wealth distribution have increased inside all countries, developed and developing countries, in spite of this progress towards elimination of absolute poverty, is a truth, is a reality. Another important point is that it's true that many people are out of extreme poverty, but they're not very far from it. The proportion of the population which is a kind of a new middle class, the people who live between $2 and $10 a day, which were only 20% of the world population in 1990, are now 40% of the world population. Okay, this strata of population are very, very sensitive to any change in the economic climate. And since the big crisis, we are still not out, which started in 2008, there are a growing number of research talking about what we call the fragile middle class. This population, which is now the biggest part of the world population, just above the poverty line, but still in a difficult situation. And there are a lot in the current situation, even in countries like Brazil or Russia, there are a lot of risks that this population go down again the poverty line, and some health events we will see later in the talk may be the cause of this middle class being fragilized and going down to a level of absolute poverty. So let's go quickly to what has been achieved about the main health MDGs. The goal for child mortality was to reduce it by 2/3. Important progress has already been achieved, since, as you see, there has been a decrease of 47% in the first 13 years of the century. But we are still far, well, not far, but we are still not at the official 2015 goal, which, if you calculate correctly, is 29 per 1,000 live birth, and it is very unlikely that this 29 target will be achieved in 2015, in spite of this important progress. And another important thing is that there are growing inequalities and discrepancies in the attainment of this MDG goal. As you see, only less than 1/3 of the high-burden countries, the high-burden countries are the 75 countries which account for 90% of all child deaths all over the world, and you see that only a minority of them are on track with reaching the target. And of course, countries from sub-Saharan Africa, especially from Francophone Africa, are among the ones which are not on track on this. Another point that could raise anxiety is that the rhythm of reduction, which was in many countries close to 4% or sometimes 5% a day of reduction of child mortality, has been slowed down in nearly all the countries, including the ones which are not on track. So big progress, but still far from the goal. It's about the same situation, even a little worse for maternal mortality, where the goal was to reduce it by 3/4. Again, important progress, about half reduction, but we are still not we are sure now that we will not be able to reach this target in 2015, since only a minority of high-burden countries are absolutely on track to do this, and since there are, and this is an important point, still very many problems in healthcare systems to support that goal. As you see, about 1/3 of all live births worldwide are not attended by correct minimum healthcare workers and appropriate healthcare facilities. There have been, of course, also important progress in the 6th Millennium Development Goal, which, by the way, as you will see, has been the one which received the most attention in the last 15-20 years, especially because of the role of the fight against the AIDS pandemic in the public opinions all over, social movements all over the world. Of course, there has been incredible progress in the number of heart-treated patients. Nearly 12 million people are treated in developing countries. It's absolutely incredible if you compare it to the fact that in 2000, the overwhelming majority of the experts in the world were saying it's impossible to treat HIV-infected patients in the South. And there were at this time only a few thousand patients who were treated in the beginning, in the early 2000. But of course, the majority of eligible patients, according to WHO guidelines, are not treated. And similarly, although the incidence of the new cases has been significantly reduced, we still have more than 2 million new infections per year, and the epidemics is more and more concentrated in a limited number of countries, especially sub-Saharan African countries, including some Francophone countries like Cameroon or République démocratique du Congo, but also extending in some important regions like Russia and China. And Jean, tu sais ça aussi bien que moi. Again, it's the same situation in the case of malaria, since again there has been major progress in the reduction of the number of cases and the malaria death rate in the current period due to some important international partnerships like Rollback Malaria. And you could say that this is a big success, that more than half of affected countries by malaria have been able to reduce incidence by more 3/4 in comparison to 1990. But when you read the statistic carefully, you see that it's not the major countries, because all these 52 countries only account for less than 5% of total cases. In some countries, especially Nigeria and RDC, still concentrate a very, very high burden of the disease and are not able to significantly reduce the incidence. So, of course, this has been one consequence, although no causal relationship can be fully acknowledged, of these MDGs, and of the fact that it's the first time that we have indicators and targets which were quantified. It's not so much a problem that the targets are not fully reached, since there is a significant evolution in that direction, and maybe these targets have been too optimistic, but they were very important in order to force the donors, the governments, to really advance in the direction, since there was an easy way to measure progress. Okay? And of course, it has been accompanied by, especially in the first years of this century, an increase in the proportion of development assistance specifically targeted on health. Again, we have to say that to some extent it's only a rattrapage, je ne sais pas comment dire rattrapage, of the fact that once there was no more Cold War, because the Soviet Union did not exist anymore. The aid in the 90s has been has decreased before starting again to increase in the 2000 period. But this increase in aid has been mainly driven by the funds devoted to the fight against the AIDS epidemic. As you see in that case, there has been very rapid increase in development assistance focused on AIDS in the beginning of the century, but since the crisis, there has been a stagnation of ODA, for ODA in general and of ODA for health, as it is exemplified in the most promising case, which was the AIDS epidemic. So there is now, we are nearly in 2015, so there is currently a very intense debate at international debate, international level to decide what will be the next goals for 2030. And there is a big discussion about the extent to which, and a consensus on the fact that we cannot simply expand and extend the previous MDGs to say, well, to even give even better targets or more ambitious targets, and that things have to be changed. Why? Because there is, I think, a consensus in the literature, I don't have time to details, to say that having these MDGs and with quantified MDGs has been have contributed to increase health development assistance, to increase accountability of donors and national governments, and of course with the creation of the Global Fund and other international partnerships, to improve the control, as you just seen, of major infectious disease like malaria, AIDS and tuberculosis. But there is also a lot of criticism of the limits and potentially perverse effects of the way the MDGs have been framed in the past. It is clear that there has been, because of the push of the public opinions toward AIDS and to a less extent to malaria, there has clearly been a strong emphasis on the Millennium Development Goal 6, the one on combating pandemics, which has influenced governments and donors to promote what we call disease-targeted vertical programs, and which have been in some cases quite effective or even cost-effective, but which may have had indirect, less positive effects on the rest of the system and of the care. For example, in 2008 at the Muskoka G8 summit, they agreed that there was too much emphasis on MDG 6, and they tried to correct it in order to put more money on, not only on MDG 6 but also on MDG 4 and MDG 5 in order to speed up the process. But still, this is true that there has been too much emphasis, and a consequence of that is that everybody agrees, or nearly everybody agrees, that there has not been enough support not only on specific diseases, but on supporting the infrastructure, especially the health system infrastructure, which will make it possible to strengthen the whole process. And it is very interesting that when the Ebola crisis occurred, there had been in many journals, in Le Monde, in Financial Times, there has been a paper, a small paper by Jim Kim, who is now the head of the World Bank, president of the World Bank, and another UN official, high-level UN official, which basically said, well, we have to face the Ebola crisis. It is a humanitarian crisis, but it is also the example that the control of these types of epidemics is very difficult or even impossible if health systems are too weak. The control system, the Soviet system, and so on. So even in the midst of a new big pandemic episode, the health system strengthening idea is present since the beginning, which was not at all the case with the previous HIV or even malaria epidemic. And of course, the consequence of that is that, although you may have many different opinions depending on the papers, in the literature, including the econometric literature, but about the reasons of what and the degree of non-optimality of that. But still, with the current MDGs, it's pretty clear that the resources are not used in a way that will maximize impact. Which means not only the impact to improve health of population by health interventions, but also the other aspects of investments that may improve health of the population. Everybody, you know, for example, that another MDGs, which is improving primary education, and especially improving primary education for health, is very, very effective in improving not only education for health, but also health of themselves and of their children. So the way we allocate resources in order to maximize impact in the health population may not be optimal with the current way of too much vertical MDGs. So, so in order to promote an alternative to the current MDGs, an item has emerged in the international debate, and this item is very much in line with what the French authorities have tried to promote at the international level. And it's very interesting because, you know, there are a number of international partnerships and alternatives, and there is one which has been promoted since the 1990s by French, Germany, and the Bureau International du Travail, the International Labour Organization. And it's called Providing for Health, P for Health, okay? Which basically has been promoting since the last 30 years this idea of universal health coverage. The problem is that when you ask even people who are very much involved in this global health debate since many years, for example, Richard Horton, the editorial manager of Lancet, and I just talked with him a few weeks ago, they don't even know that this Providing for Health initiative exists. Okay. So it's interesting that if the universal health coverage becomes, as you will see, the main, one of the main, or even the main reference for the next generation of MDGs, which will not be called MDGs anymore, but Sustainable Development Goals, to some extent that could be considered as a triumph of a French or Francophone way of thinking in the way of global health. But even if it's so, it's not sure that anybody will know. Okay? So we have to work in order to not only promote our ideas, but promote the fact that it is our ideas that are triumphing. So what do we mean by universal health coverage? It's this idea that it's an ILO slide, that the fact that coverage of the population in terms of health insurance or retirement pension funds, which has been, which is now universal in a number of countries, is not contradictory with economic growth, and even in some cases is a positive point in favor of economic growth. And you see that there is an acceleration. It took about nearly 1 century for France to reach universal coverage for health and sickness fund, and about the same for the UK. A country like South Korea has been able to do that in 20 years. And again, that does not change the fact that they've been they had, as you know, a miracle growth, at least until recently, in South Korea. So what is exactly universal health coverage? It is now accepted as the usual langue de bois of the international organization like WHO. So and basically, as early as 2005, there was this World Health Assembly resolution asking for, in favor of universal health coverage, which means ensure all people have access to needed services without the risk of financial hardship linked to paying for care. And of course, you can as they often do, they show that they've been saying that for a long time ago. And you can find at least implicit reference to such a goal in previous big declaration from the WHO. It was absolutely central in the World Health Report of 2010, which, for example, insists on the fact that 1.3 billion people worldwide do not have appropriate access to healthcare services. So, when it comes to the problem with universal health coverage is that if you don't make it more precise, it may well become, it may well make more harm than good. If you replace quantified, clear targets like the previous MDGs by a very general thing, you may lose, in fact, all impact. And you are too young, but when I started doing health, I remember that every time I went to WHO meeting in the 80s, they were talking about health for all in 2000, which was a big goal. But we're still waiting for health for all in 2000. Okay? So, and it was so vague that you could do whatever you want, or you could do nothing and keep on claiming that you were in the direction of health for all. So there is a clear risk if you adopt universal health coverage without precise definitions. And without quantitative indicators to see what you mean by that, that you go back rather than go forward, right? So basically, that means that you have to be precise in 3 dimensions, which is, what is the proportion of the population which is covered by some form of health insurance. Okay. Of course, if you cover people, but the services which are included are not appropriate, it's a failure. There have been a number of failures in the experience of a kind of mutual in Africa, especially mutual using funding from the migrant people from France and Europe, sending back money to the African countries, which were a failure after a few months or a few years, because everybody agreed to be covered, to pay the premium, but then when they came to the hospital to get the drugs, they had no drugs. So you also have to precise what types of services, what is the package of services which are covered, and also you will see that is the main difference between developing and developed world. What is the proportion of the financing for care which remains directly paid by the consumers when he gets to ask for medicines and for healthcare. So, can we do that? Okay, it's an absolutely enormous challenge, because you see that the difference between the poorest countries, or even the little less poor countries, and the OECD countries like France or the US in terms of healthcare expenditures, the gap has a little bit narrowed, but it's still like 30 times higher in our countries than in the poorest countries. Another important difference and major difficulty for universal health coverage is that the structure of the funding is totally different in our countries. For example, let's see Europe, the main proportion of healthcare expenditures are funded either by taxes or by social protection mechanism, which means that they're not they are paid by everybody to a large extent, and not by the patients when they have to consume for care. So out-of-pocket payments are limited. I will not have time, I believe, to speak about France in details. In France, in spite of everybody saying about the problem of access to care and so on, the proportion of the global health expenditure which remain directly paid by the household when they come to consume any elements of healthcare services has remained lower than 10% for the last 30 years. So the difference is absolutely enormous. You see that in Africa, in general, more than 50% on average are still paid out of pocket by patients, by sick people when they are sick and they look for care. And of course, this has an impact on the other type of a global economic situation. So the relationship is bidirectional. It's not only that if you are poor, you have more likelihood of being sick and having problems to get access to care. But on the other hand, the healthcare expenditures and the fact that these healthcare expenditures are paid directly when you are sick have effects on the economic situation of the population. And you see that important numbers, millions of people every day in the world incur what us economists call catastrophic healthcare expenditures. Sylvie has done some work and published in the EHU on this topic. Catastrophic health expenditures are defined as the fact that the household spends more than 50% of all its income once you've subtracted the food, basically the food expenditures. But once you put the food expenditures out of the picture, these people, for example, this nearly 80 million people in 2010 had to devote more than 30% of their global income as a household to pay for healthcare expenditures of some of their members. And in some cases, and it goes back to what I was saying in the beginning, it has the effect of some of these, in some cases, these catastrophic expenditures lead to the fact that people go down the poverty line, so it has a direct impact on the other aspects of the life of the individuals. And this is a short reference to some work that we carried out with one of my students, who is now Ministry of something in Mali, which shows that so being at the EHU can lead you to quite nice positions, although unfortunately it's not Ministry of Health, so it's not as good for us as it is for him. And for his people. But with Boubou, what he showed, which was, by the way, not surprising, is that out-of-pocket payment, as it is the case in Bamako, but we have data from other countries and cities, it's typically a out-of-pocket payment is typically a regressive type of payment, which means that in proportion of your income, the poorest people pay more than the richest people. So you see, for example, that the 20% less rich people in Bamako, they represent 4% of the total income, but they contribute to 12% of the total healthcare expenditures, and it's exactly the reverse from the 20 richest people in the countries. And if we were doing the Piketty-like thing, concentrating on the 1% richest, it would be even worse in terms of disequilibrium and inequality. Another important fact that you have to put into the picture is that even if you make optimistic assumptions about economic growth, knowing that one of the strongest correlation in all economic research, not only in health, is that there is a clear correlation between the rate of economic growth and the rate of increase of health expenditure. Basically, it's not a big, you don't deserve the Nobel Prize of Economics for this. Basically, the richest you are, the more the country is able to devote, to allocate more resources to the healthcare systems and to healthcare in general. But even, so if you take that correlation as a point of departure and you do some linear extrapolation of the current trends, and we did that before in the beginning of the crisis, but we had quite optimistic assumptions about economic growth in emerging countries, but indeed these were confirmed by reality. You know that the slowing of economic growth has been less intense in Latin America and especially in Africa than it is currently in France, but it will be another debate. But even with these quite optimistic assumptions, extrapolating this relationship between growth and healthcare, you see that in 2030, the total health expenditure per capita, that is not only the ones which is supported by the state or by donor assistance, but including the out-of-pocket payments by the people, would remain less than $100 per capita. And this is, it's very simple. With that amount of money, it's not possible to reach the current 2015 MDGs in 2030. And of course, it creates major difficulties to reach the universal health coverage and to give him a practical content. So, maybe, comme ça fait combien de temps que je parle? Je peux passer à la France ou ça vaut pas le coup? You're interested by France? Oh no, okay. So, basically, to synthesize the whole thing, the basic message is that it may be a good thing because it will focus on more structural mechanisms if we change the MDGs into universal health coverage, but it will become a good thing to the extent that we are able to put a very practical and quantified content to this. For example, we should state that the proportion of out-of-pocket payment for healthcare expenditures in developing countries in 2030 should be less than 20%. And to be honest, with the current state of the discussion I'm aware of, it is not clear at all that universal health coverage would be the paradigmatic new MDG, and even if it's the case, it is even less clear that we will have such precise indicators as a certain threshold, a maximum threshold for out-of-pocket payment, a list of basic services that should be accessible to 100% of the population, and so and the creation of pooled mechanism, insurance mechanism to cover the whole healthcare expenditures. So, to some extent, we've been trying to sell the French model. And if universal health coverage is agreed as the new SDG, it will create more opportunities for the French model to be sold as an example for the other countries in the world, especially in the Mediterranean world. Although we are sometimes naive, we sell the idea, and then it's the Germans or the Americans or the British who then get the money of the technical expertise and assistance to help countries design their universal health coverage system. But anyway, are we? What can we say if we are honest to the other countries, especially developing countries, about the positives and also the limitation of our own social security model? It's basically that it's true that the French social security system is a typical example of the contrary of out-of-pocket payment. It's a progressive system. We will see what it means in a minute. Therefore, it's a system which has been quite effective in promoting what we call vertical equity in healthcare financing. We've been, and also, to some extent, this vertical equity in health has also positive impact in also increasing vertical equity for the whole wealth and the whole distribution. We've been less successful, but still in terms of horizontal equity in access to care. But unfortunately, this has been accompanied by a number of inefficiency, and the fact that we have quite an equitable healthcare financing and access to care doesn't mean that we are a good country. Quite the reverse in terms of inequalities in health, in the state of health of the population. So very quickly, and I'm sure that Mohammed will give you, so it's a little bit of flavor of Mohammed and the work we're doing, because you will have very nice courses on this if you follow health economic courses in the EHU and in the masters. But there is this basic distinction, which by the way is not new because it comes back to Aristotle, so it's the Greeks, between what we call horizontal equity and vertical equity. Horizontal equity, it's basically the same thing as the Hippocratic oath. It's basically the fact that you guarantee that people who have the same need of treatment meaning medical treatment, but that can mean other aspects of health, receive similar access to treatment independently of all other characteristics. For example, and it's the case in France, the probability that you have a chemotherapy, if you are eligible for chemotherapy, is equal to everybody, whether you are a university professor like me or working a blue-collar worker. Okay? This is horizontal equity. And in general, it's quite easy to have a consensus, at least in a democratic society like ours, for horizontal equity. The different form of equity is what we call vertical equity, which means that which means unequal treatment of people. The idea is that when people have a different situation, you treat differently these people in order to reduce the differences between the better off and the worse off. Okay? And of course, vertical equity will differ. You will create more controversies in a democratic society, because depending on the degree of egalitarianism you are for example, I'm not sure, but my degree of egalitarianism is the same as the one of Didier, isn't it, Didier? He doesn't want to answer. But anyway, and it's normal that we have the controversies inside our society about the degree to which we do more for the worse off in order to reduce the differences between the worse off and the better off. In the case of France, it is clear that the healthcare financing system is typically progressive, the contrary of what I showed you about Bamako and about nearly all developing countries, which means that the payments are progressive and they increase with the ability to pay, with the income of the population. I don't have time, I don't have time to detail the system, French system. You know that the main part of the system is a compulsory sickness fund system, and of course you have supplementary insurance, like you have, vous avez la NAIF, enfin la mutuelle des étudiants. Most of you have a supplementary insurance as students, for example, which complement the main system. Again, contrary to some things that are even told, the coverage of the population has increased, including the supplementary insurance. The number of people who have no supplementary health insurance is now less than 5% in France, and there has been a number of specific policies in order to, even in recent years, to reduce, to facilitate access of the most vulnerable to this supplementary health insurance, or mutual or private insurance. And you see that about 3/4 of all expenditures are covered by the social security system, the mandatory health insurance system, and as I said before, the out-of-pocket payment remained less than 10% in recent years. So this is clear that it is a progressive vertical equity thing. You see that the richest you are, the more you contribute to the public health insurance. For the supplementary health insurance, since premiums are more or less related to your degree of risk, it's not the case. Since the public system remains the main part of the healthcare financing, this is a very progressive system, and this is, and to some extent, to a large extent, the health insurance system will distribute money from the sick people to the people who are not sick, which means that it also will distribute money between the young people to the old people. But since, unfortunately, to some extent, the poor people are more likely to be sick than the rich people. When you do the whole calculation, you see that it also redistributes money from the richest to the poorest people of the population. You see that at least for the public system, the benefits remains more important for the 60% poorest part of the population, who, by the way, pays less in terms of income given to the premiums of the health system. So it's a redistributive system, not only from the non-sick to the sick, but also from the richest to the poorest part of the population. In terms of access to care, I won't be, I'll be very quick. In terms of contacts, for example, with the hospital or contacts with ambulatory care, there is equality of access to care. The type of care is different. As you see, the people with the poorest people tend to use more the general practitioners, while on the reverse, the richest people tend to use more specialists than primary care. So the mix of care is a little bit different, but in terms of contacts with the health system, there is equality, and to the extent that it doesn't checkmate for most problems, it doesn't make a significant quality difference between starting with the specialist or starting with the GP. There's not a problem of equity there. But of course, for other types of things, especially for all the prevention-related healthcare services, this is less the case, and the poor people who need it more, and the rich people to a large extent tend to consume less than these preventive services, which is one of the major problems and limitation in the horizontal equity in access to care in our country. This is something that is less known, which is the fact that before any, any taxes and before any forms of redistribution through education and health, the differences in primary income between the richest 20% and the poorest 20% is something like 8. The difference is 8. By the way, it's very, that means that France remains one of the most egalitarian countries in the world. It's a lot more in many countries. Okay? When you remain at this level of disaggregation. But you see that this is reduced by taxes, but also by social transfer, by more than half, because after all this redistribution, we go as low as only 3 in the differences between this income after that in our population. And as you see here, health is, after education, the major source of redistribution. Our social security system does more to reduce income inequality in France than the all taxes systems, including the useless impôt sur la fortune, does in terms of redistribution. But of course, and I will conclude of that, you heard it will be another talk by me or by someone else, like Bruno Ventoux. We are one of the countries with the highest inefficiencies in terms of use of these resources, and which create, of course, problems of deficit, but I don't want to be too long on this. And unfortunately, in spite of what I just said, France is a country in Western Europe which has, with the exception of Finland, the highest inequalities in life expectancies between, this is the case of men, between social classes or social groups in the population. So in spite of all what I've been referring to, that doesn't change the problem of health inequalities at the level of the health of the population. So, just to conclude, what can be if I do a talk like I did in Dubai to our colleagues from Middle East or colleagues from Africa, what can you learn, what can you get from the French experience in terms of things that you should do, but on the other hand, things that you should avoid. Okay? The first thing is that you really need strong information systems on most of the indicators, on access to care, on financing, but also on health status and on global income and welfare state. Because if you don't have that, the debate becomes fully ideological, and you cannot see if you are progressing, in what direction you are really progressing. And also you need to, and we've done a lot of research in my group and consequently in the ASU to assess the relationships which are not unidirectional relationship, but complex causal relationships between these indicators. And also you need to clarify it's acceptable that this is different according to countries. You have to clarify the underlying value judgments. For example, it made me think about it because you know they are talking a lot about the changes in the Catholic Church currently, and as you know, it seems that it's the African bishops who are the more reluctant to go in the direction that Pope Francois is trying to get to the church. But to a large extent, they have to take, the Catholic Church has to take that into account. The fact that the judgment on a number of social and legal and cultural issues may be different depending on the context. And of course, you can accept that the degree of progressivity, for example, the degree of vertical equity in your system may be different. The problem is that you need to make it more clear in the debate and to clarify for example, the degree of egalitarianism that you accept or that you want to reach with your health policy. And three other things are very important is that, of course, I was not able to develop that, is that in the field of health you cannot ignore the consequences in the other sectors. And so the consequences in terms of macroeconomic impact of social protection and on public deficit is a very important thing. And again, we don't have to be idealistic. Some people who are against the development of social protection, they present it as a burden for economic growth. Okay? But on the other hand, when I talk to people like you, usually you believe that giving more money for health is good for growth, is good for development. It's not always the case. In some cases, it's better to invest in other aspects, maybe to invest in infrastructure or in education and so on. So we have to take that into account. We have to have a real informed debate with the Ministry of Economics or the Ministry of Finance, and not to oppose to some ideological views that social protection is bad for growth, to oppose this idea that social protection and improving health at any cost is good for development. That's not always the case. The other thing is that it is clear that if we want to give strong indicators for universal health coverage and give it a content, the main goal would be to replace out-of-pocket payments by prepayment insurance mechanism in which you don't pay because you're sick, but you pay a priori, independently of your likelihood of being sick in the period for which you are covered. And this is maybe the most difficult thing. It is the most difficult thing. By the way, we have examples with the current discussion in our parliament that it is difficult. You know, if you hear the news, you've heard that currently this week in France you had at the same time a discussion about the new public health law, which is supposed to improve public health, especially to increase prevention, and at the same time a discussion about the budget of social security and what types of new savings we can get to reduce the deficit, especially on the sickness fund. And interestingly enough, there's a kind of dichotomy between these two discussions. And this is the most difficult thing that you have to try to do if you are a decision maker in France or in a developing country, if you want to promote universal health coverage, is that you have to develop at the same time reforms for healthcare financing, for improving the healthcare system, and also for improving the responsibility and behaviors toward health of your own population. If you don't do that at the same time, with a coherence between these aspects, you fail. And the source of failure of many healthcare reforms in developing countries, I could give you examples in the discussion, come from the fact that they were not able, and in France we cannot give too much lessons to people about that, to be able to coordinate at the same time these three aspects.
Il y a quelques biais qui sont intéressants à regarder. Le premier biais, c'est que la différence de mortalité par groupes sociaux, en très grande partie, on le voit très bien sur tes diapositives, c'est une différence de niveau d'éducation. C'est-à-dire que si on neutralisait le niveau d'éducation, on neutraliserait la différence de mortalité, je veux bien le parler. On le voit bien, l'accès aux soins, ou le fait que l'on croit ou qu'on ne croit pas aux stratégies de vaccination et de prévention est directement corrélé au niveau d'éducation, qui lui-même est corrélé au niveau d'income. Et donc, ce que l'on teste en réalité dans toutes les structures de prévention, c'est le niveau d'éducation. Ça, c'est un premier point. Et le deuxième point, c'est que, effectivement, sur ta diapositive, on reflète la vision du monde qu'on a eue dans les 30 dernières années et qui a complètement scotomisé un des éléments essentiels de la prise en charge de la santé, c'est que la santé des hommes est bien moins bonne que celle des femmes. Et ça, c'est un point extrême, c'est un point extrêmement important, mais qui est éliminé dès la première truc en disant le problème c'est d'aider les femmes et pas d'aider les hommes, c'est très intéressant. Et c'est justement ce qui se passe dans ce pays qui est probablement la chose qui ressort de la manière la plus spectaculaire de toutes les enquêtes PISA, c'est qu'il y a une dégradation extrêmement rapide chez les garçons de milieu pauvre du niveau d'éducation, et on peut penser qu'au contraire, dans cette tranche-là, l'espérance de vie va diminuer. Parce que l'adhésion, on perçoit très très nettement, nous, dans nos stratégies de prévention, l'adhésion des populations les moins éduquées aux stratégies de prévention de santé est extrêmement faible. Et compte tenu de leur niveau de performance en lecture, actuellement, la dégradation extrêmement rapide, il y a 15% de moins qui ont l'accès aux notions les plus basiques chez la population de garçons de moins de 15 ans. Le niveau de la population française est colossal. Ça, c'est effectivement, ce que tu racontes là, une partie extrêmement importante de l'accès à la santé, c'est l'accès à la connaissance. Et donc c'est un vrai point. Le problème de l'accès à la connaissance actuellement, c'est celui des jeunes garçons des populations les plus pauvres en France, et c'est spectaculaire.
Alors Didier, sur la première question, on ne peut pas rentrer dans le détail, mais peut-être d'ailleurs il pourrait y avoir des choses plus pointues qu'on présenterait avec Bruno Ventoux sur le sujet, sur la question éducation. Alors d'abord, effectivement, selon les pays, au niveau de la description empirique des choses, tu as des pays qui ont tendance à présenter les inégalités de santé en termes d'espérance de vie, d'autres choses, plutôt en privilégiant la variable niveau d'éducation. C'est le cas des Britanniques, et des pays, c'est le cas depuis des plans Kélinet, tu sais, en France, il y a très très longtemps, plutôt à partir de ce qu'on appelle la catégorie socio-professionnelle, la PCS maintenant, dans la nomenclature de l'INSEE. Et en règle générale, que tu utilises la variable niveau d'éducation ou la variable emploi ou niveau de revenu, les résultats sont à peu près les mêmes. D'accord ? Par contre, là où tu as tout à fait raison, c'est que ce constat-là, c'est-à-dire que les variables sont presque interchangeables, a fait qu'on discute beaucoup moins, en tout cas d'un débat qui par contre agite depuis 20 ans les économètres de la santé de façon très active, qui sont, est-ce que ces variables sont vraiment interchangeables ou est-ce qu'il y a un effet propre ? Et dans la littérature, en général en économie de la santé, il y a eu tout un débat pour savoir, est-ce qu'il y a par exemple, une fois qu'on a neutralisé l'effet revenu, d'accord, est-ce qu'il y a un effet propre de l'éducation, ou vice-versa, une fois qu'on a neutralisé l'effet éducation, est-ce qu'il y a un effet revenu, et surtout, est-ce qu'il y a des effets additionnels ou multiplicatifs entre ces deux variables? Alors ça a l'air comme ça finalement pas très important, mais c'est très très important en termes de politique. Par exemple, la plupart des études économétriques qui comparent différents types d'investissements tendent à montrer que si vous investissez dans l'éducation, et notamment dans l'éducation des filles, qui est que, par $1 dans l'éducation, qui est le dada de Amartya Sen, un de mes prix Nobel d'économie préférés. Dans les études économétriques, notamment faites par la Banque mondiale, y compris dans certains résultats qu'on a eus avec Bruno dans un premier temps, tu montres que $1 investi dans l'éducation a plus d'effet sur les indicateurs de santé, d'accord, que $1 investi dans les systèmes de santé sur la santé. Donc, voilà. Et donc, d'une certaine façon, c'est une vraie question, mais du coup, vous comprenez bien que si vous arrivez avec un papier comme ça dans une discussion interministérielle au Cameroun ou au Nigeria, le ministère des Finances va dire bon, ben, j'augmente le budget, ne me cassez pas les couilles avec vos histoires d'Ebola, je vais... Mais attends, ceci dit, je termine là-dessus.
Dans un pays comme la France, où c'est visible à l'œil nu, parce que quand même, effectivement, le tassement de la différence entre les 20% les plus riches et les 20% les plus pauvres, ça se voit à l'œil nu. Mais en revanche, ce que tu vois, c'est-à-dire que tu vois bien que quelqu'un qui est à 2000 € dans les hôpitaux, tu vois bien que la femme de ménage, la femme de salle, l'infirmière et l'interne n'ont pas la même espérance de vie. Et pourtant, elles ont exactement le même income, mais elles n'ont pas la même éducation. C'est-à-dire que la proportion d'obèses, de fumeurs, n'est pas du tout le même, et ça n'est pas du tout lié aux ressources, c'est lié au milieu éducationnel. Et donc ça veut dire que la vraie priorité actuellement, si on veut améliorer l'espérance de vie, en France, c'est l'éducation, et celle qui est la population, qui doit être la population cible, je suis désolé, c'est pas les femmes, c'est les hommes pauvres. Voilà, c'est les adolescents pauvres, parce que c'est eux qui ont la plus basse espérance de vie, et ça va s'aggraver. Voilà, parce que eux n'ont pas accès à la base même de l'éducation.
Alors attends, je finis de te répondre sur le premier point, puis après je te réponds là-dessus. Donc, ceci dit, ce qu'on a commencé à montrer avec Bruno et avec d'autres, c'est que en même temps, on montre aussi qu'il y a des relations. Quand on investit $1 dans la santé, on améliore non seulement la santé, mais aussi l'éducation. Ça a des effets.
C'est les pays très pauvres, ça. En France, c'est pas en dire.
Non, là, pour l'instant, je parle des pays en développement. Et donc, il est possible, il est même probable, qu'une partie des effets qui sont liés sur le développement, sur les indicateurs, hein, aussi bien les indicateurs de santé que les indicateurs économiques, qui sont liés à l'investissement dans la santé, sont moins bien capturés, mais pas parce qu'ils n'existent pas, sont moins bien capturés que, y compris les effets sur les autres variables, dont l'éducation, que les effets inverses. C'est-à-dire que si on arrive, et c'est pour ça que faire de l'économétrie de plus en plus sophistiquée, avec de plus en plus d'équations dans les systèmes, ça nous permet de mieux identifier les effets propres, et on pense que probablement une des raisons, par exemple, de ce constat que l'éducation semblerait être plus efficace que certains investissements dans la santé, viendrait plus d'un artefact statistique dans la capacité de mesurer les synergies entre les variables que d'une réelle supériorité d'investissement dans l'éducation. Ceci dit, ce qui est vrai, je reste sur les pays en développement, ce qui est vrai, c'est que il y a un problème qui doit être attaqué. Je ne reviens pas sur mes conclusions, qui est qu'effectivement, quand on investit dans le système éducationnel, le lien entre investir dans le système d'éducation et l'amélioration de l'éducation est relativement direct. Si tu te débrouilles, comme l'a fait dans certaines expériences la Banque mondiale, pour que les professeurs soient devant leurs élèves quand ils sont payés pour le faire, alors qu'il y en a à peu près 40% qui ne le sont pas, en tout cas pas tout le temps dans les pays en développement, ça a un effet immédiat que tu captures sur l'amélioration de l'éducation. Pour des tas de raisons que vous comprenez très bien ici, quand on investit dans l'amélioration du système de santé, des fois on se trompe dans la manière de le faire, ou même si on le fait bien, il y a d'autres, par exemple si on améliore l'accès aux médicaments, mais que par ailleurs il n'y a pas les gens pour les délivrer, donc ça semble plus difficile, plus compliqué, mais d'où ça nous donne plus de travail pour améliorer, y compris à l'IHU, pour qu'un investissement dans le système de santé se transforme en réelle amélioration de la santé de la population. Donc là aussi, c'est un champ de travail. Alors, après, sur ce que tu dis, Didier, on n'a pas le temps de... c'est parce qu'on n'a pas le temps de tout faire, mais je suis en gros d'accord avec toi, c'est-à-dire que, effectivement, ce qui explique, mais c'est le sujet d'un autre exposé, ce qui explique ce paradoxe français d'inégalité maintenue au niveau de l'état de santé, en dépit d'un système de soins qui n'est pas trop mauvais, qui a même été classé premier système du monde par l'OMS dans son rapport les années 2000, qui étaient controversées, mais qui n'étaient pas si faux que ça, hein, c'est effectivement plutôt des choses qui se jouent en amont du système de soins, même si le système de soins se ferait plus, et effectivement de la capacité de cibler les bonnes variables. Par exemple, quand tu dis quelle est la pire situation, nous ce qu'on trouve, Yolande a dû t'en parler plusieurs fois, dans toutes les études, dans toutes les enquêtes qu'on fait, quelles qu'elles soient, une fois qu'on a ajusté sur les principales variables, toutes choses égales par ailleurs, on a ajusté sur le niveau de revenu, y compris sur le niveau d'éducation, il y a un truc qui sort, notamment en PACA, mais pas seulement, ces familles monoparentales. Le fait aujourd'hui, c'est ce que tu dis d'une certaine façon, hein, le fait d'appartenir à une famille monoparentale, toutes choses égales par ailleurs, c'est-à-dire à âge égal, etc. Hein, famille monoparentale voulant dire, pas toujours, mais presque toujours, mère et mère se retrouvant toutes seules, ça augmente de façon stratosphérique, ça augmente les risques relatifs de façon tellement grosse qu'on les voit.
Chez les garçons.
Ben voilà. Ça, il faudrait regarder. C'est une bonne idée.
Là aussi, c'est une observation.
Par rapport à ça, et donc,
malheureuse avec un gosse qui a 13 ans en train de faire le son virtuel au lycée.
Et donc, mais ça implique, on le voit d'ailleurs à l'occasion des trucs sur les allocations familiales, ça implique quand même, c'est le simple fait de dire qu'il faut foutre le paquet sur les familles monoparentales. D'abord, on sait que ça marche. Quand on regarde les expériences qui ont fait suite au rapport de Marmotte sur les déterminants sociaux de la santé dans les villes pauvres, parfois plus pauvres que Marseille, qui ont fait des politiques systématiques de réduction des inégalités, en général des inégalités de santé en particulier, quand c'est fait de façon concentrée, hein, en ciblant bien les bonnes populations et de façon systématique, on a des succès incroyables. Birmingham, une des pires villes, c'est un peu comme Marseille, une des pires villes aux États-Unis qui était je ne sais combien de pourcents en dessous de la moyenne nationale en termes de développement des enfants. Maintenant, ils sont parmi les villes dans lesquelles, dans 10 ans, hein, ils ont non seulement dépassé la moyenne nationale britannique, mais ils sont dans le peloton de tête des villes britanniques en matière d'indicateurs de santé des enfants. D'accord ? Mais on a ciblé une politique vraiment en direction de ces familles à problème, etc. Et le problème en France, le problème en France, c'est que quand on veut faire ça, on touche au sacro-saint égalité de tous, une certaine interprétation de l'égalité, hein, qui est plutôt équité horizontale ou équité verticale, et ça coince. La preuve, quand vous voulez simplement faire que les allocations familiales soient un peu plus progressives dans leurs bénéfices, vous avez les familles menacent de telles manifestations dans la rue que le ministre recule.
Très bien.